När ett barn blir allvarligt sjukt behöver du hantera en ny vardag. Men det finns stöd att få. Ronald McDonald Hus ger familjer möjligheten att bo tillsammans medan barnet vårdas på sjukhus. Vill du ge fler familjer samma möjlighet? Swisha till 970 22.
I dagens podd pratar jag med Tom Holland. Inte skådespelaren som spelar Spindelmannen i Marvel-filmerna alltså, utan författaren och historikern Tom Holland. Han hade för övrigt avskytt att jag nämnde Spindelmannen, vilket han gjorde klart för mig innan vi spelade in, och han även har sagt i sin podd The Rest is History som han har ihop med Dominic Sandbrook. Den rekommenderar jag verkligen. Och han är lite av en drömgäst för mig, för jag har, förutom att jag lyssnar på hans podd, så har jag läst flera av hans böcker. Och den senaste heter Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. Det är främst den vi pratar om i podden. Som ni har märkt har jag haft lite av ett tema i podden där jag pratar med gäster om kristendom, sekularism och trosfrågor överlag. Och det här är en del i det. Titeln på boken talar egentligen för sig själv, och jag tror att Tom Holland har rätt i den tesen han driver, att vår civilisation vilar till mycket större del på kristendomen än på någonting annat. Vi vill gärna tro att det är mer upplysningsfilosofi, kanske efterkrigstidens rationalitet och modernism och sådär. Och redan de gamla grekerna, Aten och Rom och sådär. Men frågar man Holland så har mycket av kritiken mot kristendomen ofta haft också en ganska kristen karaktär. Väldigt mycket med vår moral och vårt sätt att tänka på och se på varandra är formade av kristendomen snarare än någonting annat. Vi går in på det i podden. Vi pratar också om boken han skrev för 10 år sedan om islam, In the Shadow of the Sword. Den blev också en dokumentär på Channel 4 med titeln Islam the Untold Story. Och både boken och dokumentären ledde till att Tom Holland fick hård kritik eftersom han gjorde det man har gjort med kristendomen i hundratals år. Det vill säga, han letade efter det historiska belägg för berättelsen i den heliga skriften, i det här fallet då Koranen. Han konstaterar också att de tidigaste källorna är skrivna ett par 100 år efter Muhammeds liv, och att det mesta i berättelsen därför är omöjligt att belägga. Denna historiska beskrivning upplevde många muslimer då, eller i alla fall tillräckligt många, som stötande. Han utsattes för mängder av dödshot och han blev cancellerad, som man säger nu för tiden. En visning för historiker fick ställas in av säkerhetsskäl. För det man kan förstå är väl att studera Koranen, det finns ju inte en enda troende muslim som inte tror att Koranen är Guds ord. Och då att studera Koranen som vilken text som helst, det verkar väldigt svårt att genomföra helt enkelt. Det påstås ingenting stötande om islam i boken eller dokumentären. Men det här är också en förklaring då, som vi är inne på sen också i poddarna. Det är en förklaring till varför så få försöker att studera den historiska Muhammed, eller vad stämmer egentligen i Koranen, vad stämmer i haditerna. Allt detta och mer därtill pratar vi om i dagens podd. Och om ni går in på ivararpi.substack.com så hittar ni länkarna till det vi pratar om där. Bland annat böckerna samt avsnitten i The Rest is History som nämns. Men nu till dagens gäst. Du lyssnar på Rak Höger med mig, Ivar Arpi. So welcome Tom Holland to Rak Höger.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a great pleasure to have you on. This is my podcast, but I'm a regular, as I said before we started recording, I'm a very avid listener to your podcast, The Rest is History.
I'm very honored. Thank you.
So I will probably tie a few of my questions into your podcast, but I'm just one question is that why don't you use the rest is history more as a tagline? Like it's right there, and the rest is history. Why don't you end every episode with "and the rest is history"?
I don't really like the title.
You
to
don't?
be honest, it wasn't my choice. My original choice, and this is one that nobody involved in the podcast ever lets me forget, was Pod Past, which I thought was a brilliant title. But they, I think, probably dodged a bullet with that. I was overruled. But I don't have any particular stake with The Rest is History, because actually, I don't actually think it makes great sense.
Really? Why?
Because history is always changing. So you could say, and the rest is history. But the history can be rewritten. History can be forgotten. It can be reinterpreted.
Oh yeah, but it's usually when you like tell a historical story or something and dramatized, and then you can end like, instead of saying "and they lived happily ever after," you can say "and the rest is history." It's like,
you're right. Probably we should use it more, but I will maybe try and introduce it. I'll try and do it just for you.
Yeah. Thank you. You do every time for me. But then you've like, The Rest is Politics is another podcast. But
yeah, that doesn't make sense, because that's not a phrase in English at all.
No, it doesn't make sense. And it's, as a non-English speaker, it makes even less sense. Like, am I missing something? I started Googling, like, have I missed this expression?
No, it's just kind
just
of word soup.
Yeah, and they're just riding on your success, aren't they?
That's very much how we like to see it. Yeah.
Yeah. I've read like your last. I know you're writing a new book, so I've tried to get you on, but you've been a professional writer, writing your book and doing your podcast, not having time for. So I'm very thankful that you had time for me today. But the last book you wrote was Dominion, and it's a very fascinating book. And I've had a theme on this podcast for a few months or a year or so, discussing Christianity and secularism. But basically what you show in your book is that Christianity upended the world as people knew it in the ancient world. And I think you said I'm not sure if it was in a recent podcast or a live show you had with about Christianity and belief in God, that you said that when you read the Bible as a child, you identified more with Pontius Pilate than with Jesus.
Yes, I did.
Are you still in Camp Pilate, or have you? Or what made you switch?
Well, it was so I loved the Bible as a child, but I loved anything that was about kind of the ancient world as a child. So I loved the Bible in the way that I loved, reading about the Greek myths or stories of early Rome or King Arthur or anything like that. And the awful truth is that I admired the ancient empires rather in the way that, as an even younger boy, I'd admire dinosaurs. They were kind of big and fierce and glamorous and safely extinct, but I kind of adored them. And so it wasn't just Pontius Pilate. It was Pharaoh, king of Babylon, king of Assyria, king of Persia. No. I love them all. They're all kind of great. Going around kicking sand in the faces of the children of Israel or whoever.
Yeah,
I just found them kind of more glamorous, really. And so I always slightly resented Christianity for coming along and spoiling all that. I had an almost synesthetic sense of the ancient world, that ancient Greece, ancient Rome, it had always been blue skies, lovely kind of marble pillars everywhere, people in togas, having parties, loads of fun. And then a load of dreary old Christians turn up and it immediately starts raining. And it's miserable and all, lose the central heating and it's kind of just glum. And basically, I got that from the 18th century. I got that from the Enlightenment. It was a kind of distorted echo of that. And as a child, that's what I'd picked up. And I never really questioned it. It was just kind of background furniture, really. It wasn't that I was writing about it or thinking about it particularly. But I recognized that as an explanation for why I was more interested, say, in Caesar than I was in Jesus, why I was more on the side of Pilate than I was of the man standing before him. But then I initially wanted to be a novelist, but then I just kind of realized actually what I was always interested in was history. That was kind of it was the wellspring of my inspiration. And it was partly because it went back to my childhood. It was the things that I'd loved as a child. And maybe you just have to write about, it's the well springs of your childhood that determine the kind of writer you become as an adult, perhaps. Anyway, so I wrote about Rome. I wrote about Greece. I wrote about Persia.
Yeah, and these books are also, these books are great as well. You bought Rubicon in 2003 and then 2005 Persian Fire.
Yeah. So And my aim was to try, I suppose, because I was coming from novelist, from having written as a novelist, But I wanted, insofar as it was possible, bearing in mind the paucity of the sources and the inevitable limitations of those, I wanted to try and get inside the mindset of all the ancient peoples that I was writing about, so that people would see the world through Roman or Spartan or Persian or Athenian eyes. And I found doing that quite a strain, because the Romans or the Spartans, doing that, it brought home to me how alien they were, how frightening they were. And I just became increasingly kind of conscious of that, and therefore interested in how and why it was that actually the Romans weren't remotely, our ancestors. We may think that there may be kind of, in certain ways, obvious parallels, but those parallels are not direct. And so I began to identify Christianity as the kind of the process of change that explained why I was the way I was, why the society that I lived in was the way it was, and why that society was so fundamentally different to the classical world that had existed before Christianity. And it was a kind of slow burning interest, because it kind of took me time to adjust to the possibility that this might be what I thought about. But the third book of history I wrote, called Millennium in English, was about the 11th century, which I think is actually the great turning point. So in all kinds of ways, history doesn't change with the flicking of a light switch. Even after the conversion of Constantine, the world doesn't immediately become kind of Christian in the way that it does in the Middle Ages. And I identified the 11th century as the period where I think things really do change, and where the world that we inhabit today gets its first great iteration, because essentially we live in a revolutionary society, I think. And what happens in the 11th century is the first great experience of revolution. And after that, we in the West, we in the Latin West, are set on a course that we've never really left. The Reformation, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, what we're going through at the moment, these are all iterations of what happened in the 11th century. And the 11th century, of course, in turn, is inconceivable without the initial primal Christian revolution.
Yeah. So what happened in the 11th century, apart from the Vikings becoming Christian?
Well, I mean, that is absolutely a part of the story, a sense that the Christian people are ceasing to be, in a way, I mean, confined to the Roman world, which of course initially they had been to. Right the way through the Christian Roman period, there was a sense that Christianity was only for the Romans, or opposed that, but he was in a minority. So when, say, Gregory the Great sends missionaries to convert the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, it's because he feels that Britain had been a part of the Roman world. He doesn't send missionaries, say, to Germany beyond the Rhine, or indeed to Scandinavia. But it's once the English have been converted, they don't have these hang-ups. And so they go off to convert, they're Saxon, they feel Saxon, so they go off to convert the Saxons. And of course, the Scandinavians come calling in Britain. So there's that kind of process. So by the 11th century, there's a sense that Christianity has spread to, the Scandinavian Northlands, even to Iceland, that it's spreading eastwards as well, to lands that the Caesars hadn't really known. And this coincides with an impulse that I think is very intimately associated with the consciousness of the first millennium. The book of Revelation, the year 1000, it has a kind of peculiar saliency. And even though the church itself officially, following again in the footsteps of Augustine, doesn't want to acknowledge that the year 1000 had a literal meaning, nevertheless, I think that experience of living through the millennial anniversary of Christ's birth and then death and resurrection focuses for the Christian people the idea that a great period of change is happening. And when Christ fails to come again in 1033, a sense that Christendom has been given a chance to reform itself, to cleanse itself, to purify itself, becomes a kind of fever idea, both among radicals who are not part of the church, who are maybe wandering the roads or living as hermits or whatever, but also in the upper echelons of the Roman church, the church in Rome. And there's a kind of alliance between those at the bottom, those at the top, which has as its goal the sense that that just as an individual can be baptized and born again, so the whole of Christendom should be baptized and born again. That the claim that earthly lords, kings, emperors, chieftains, whatever, that they had a stake in the dimension of the supernatural, that they can sway it, that this should be cleansed, and that the church itself should take possession of it. It kind of derives again from Augustine, who's this titanic figure in the history of the church. But what you have is twin dimensions that are inherited from him. This notion that the fallen world is the dimension of the cyculum, which is a Latin word meaning the essentially the span of living memory, and by extension, the idea that in the fallen world everything must be born and live and die, and that everything is born upon the swirl and sweep of time, including emperors, including kingdoms, and that the only thing that can redeem fallen humanity from the passage of time, from the kind of inexorable effects of living within the cyculum, is the bond, in Latin, the religio, that the church provides people to the radiant eternity of heaven. And so this idea that you have twin dimensions, religio and cyculum, in the 11th century is weaponized by reformers in the church against bishops who don't agree with this program, against kings and emperors, against large constituencies. But it proves so inspiring. People get so behind it, across the social spectrum, that by the middle of the 12th century, effectively we have what could be called a revolution. And the medieval church, which, Protestants, people who count themselves heirs of the Enlightenment, atheists, see the Catholic Church as an inherently reactionary roadblock against progress. Couldn't be further from the truth in the Middle Ages, certainly. It was the first great revolutionary institution, and it's marked by all kinds of expressions that we will recognize in subsequent periods. So this is the period when universities are born. Universities emerge because in this new world in which it's the church who is providing the Christian people with frameworks of justice, frameworks of law, there's a need for intellectuals to work out what these laws should be, and people to apply the laws and to interpret them.
And you also show, because the regular dramaturgy or story about how we became so enlightened and secular today and rational is that we, at least this is a story in Sweden and in many parts of the West, at least, we freed ourselves from the shackles of the church, so to speak.
Right.
We discovered against the church's will. We discovered astronomy, and Galileo Galilei, he fought the church. But you show in Dominion that actually many of these boneheaded Christians were actually thinking
they were not boneheaded. They were not boneheaded.
No, exactly. No. You show that they actually thought that rationality and science were a way to, some of them at least, to discover God's
completely.
will.
Yes, yeah. And so over the course of the 12th century into the 13th century, universities have got hold of copies of Aristotle, both from Spain and from Constantinople, and they integrate it into the very fabric of the theology of the Roman Church. So reason is implanted at the absolute heart of the understanding of what a Christian people should be thinking. And the universities come to provide this kind of cutting edge of radical readiness to reinterpret society that leaves a lot of people behind. So just this morning, you mentioned the podcast I do. We released the first in a 3-part series about a group of heretics who are misnamed the Cathars in the south of France, but who essentially were Christians who had been left behind by the radical and revolutionary movement of the Catholic Church, of the Roman Church. So they didn't, consider themselves to be heretics, but because things had moved on so fast, they were viewed by the intellectuals and the elites in the Roman Church as hopeless kind of deplorables who should all be slaughtered. And I guess, a parallel that is not entirely tendentious, because it arises, I think, from exactly the same impulse, would be, say, people who've been to university having very radical views, say, on trans rights, and people out in the countryside who haven't been to university thinking it's all nonsense. So this trend in which intellectuals seize the commanding heights of various institutions and force through ideas that to the vast mass of people initially seem ridiculous, but then in time they come to catch up with them. This is something that's born in the 12th century. So also is the idea that this is a vision of the world that is worth propagating, if needs be, at the point of a sword. So this is also the age that sees the birth of crusades. And again, if we look at future periods of revolutionary ferment, this again is a characteristic of it. Now, you mentioned how, say, in Sweden and Scandinavia, the medieval church has come to be seen as the embodiment of everything that's hidebound and backward. That, of course, is because it's the fate of all revolutionary institutions that they have two kinds of enemy. They have the enemy that I've just been describing, those who get left behind, who counter-revolutionary people who resent the idea of what's being done. But the other kind of enemy are those who feel that the revolution hasn't gone far enough. And it's always the way that the molten lava of a revolution starts to calcify, starts to freeze. And this happens over the course of the 13th century, over the course of the Middle Ages. So a lot of the people who come to be condemned as heretics are either people like the inverted commas Cathars, people who are left behind, or people who say, look, the radicalism has atrophied. The people in charge of the church are now as bad as the people that they replaced. They're all corrupt elites. We need to overthrow them. And you have spasms of this again and again. And in the 16th century, it serves to precipitate what today we call the Reformation. But it's only one of, it's not the Reformation, because the process that of revolution in the 11th century was called by those who undertook it reformatio, the remaking of the world, Reformation. So in that sense, although Luther regarded Gregory VII, the great pope of this, who of the 11th century, who is the kind of the standard bearer of the revolution in that period, as the most monstrous of all popes, that's deeply ironic, because in many ways Luther is absolutely recognizably standing in a line of inheritance from Gregory VII, as in due course are the French revolutionaries, as are the Russian revolutionaries, as are radicals today in today's society.
I would just like to go back to the beginning a little bit, because many, if you grow up as a boy, of course, and girl, but you love adventure, you want... I loved Lord of the Rings, and anybody who listens to this podcast, I've done many episodes on like the theology and interpretations of his works, in conversation with and in disagreement with others. But speaking about doing what you loved as a boy, I try to bring it up as often as I can. But I wanted more of the war in those books. I wanted the fighting, more fighting, and I thought that the hobbits.
Your Viking inheritance kicking in.
Yeah, or toxic masculinity, if you would like, if a more modern interpretation. But I thought that when the hobbits, when Frodo and Sam were walking and carrying the ring towards Mordor, and like talking to Gollum, I thought that was tedious. I just wanted the blowing in the horns on the hills and riding to death against your enemy, and then and so that's why I think you get sort of seduced by the Spartans or the legionaries and Caesar, because they have all that. And what does the church offer? The church offers martyrs, basically, or you could say they offer the Crusades and stuff like that. But when you look at like a movie like 300, I know it's not a correct historical movie, but it just sets the tone in the beginning when they hold up a child, and I think the narrator says, who's the same actor who plays Faramir in Lord of the Rings, by the way. Yeah, he says, if the child was puny, it was or something or sick, it was discarded, and then they like show a whole. Yeah, like a boneyard, like that's where they just throw the baby and then they just leave them there. And of course, it's not an actual showing, but if you read about the Spartans, or the Romans, they don't like weakness in the least. They don't celebrate weakness. Their martyrs were not the same kind of martyrs that we mean, at least. Their heroes did not die on a cross.
So 300, I think, is the best film ever made about the ancient world. And that's not because it's accurate. Of course it isn't. You know, the Persian king was not a 13-foot drag queen. They didn't have rhinoceroses. None of that is, of course, they didn't fight in tight black underpants. None of that is true. But it's the best film about the ancient world.
What a historical killjoy!
Yeah, well, no, I'm not, because I'm going to big it up because it's authentically cruel. It's authentically true to the Spartan way of understanding strength and weakness. And again, if you watch films about the ancient world, there will be a kind of contemporary perspective smuggled in. So there'll be a Christian slave, or there'll be, in Gladiator, a kind of a senator who in some way is a kind of liberal or something. And this is completely ahistorical. 300 absolutely worships strength and power. So if you remember the Ephialtes, who in this version of it is...
Under miljontals år har djur utvecklat sofistikerade parningsritualer. Fåglar dansar, vargar ylar och Oscar går in på Amazon för att förbereda sin date night lasagne till King. På Amazon hittar han levande ljus, lyxiga vinglas till fyndpris och en extra tandborste utifall att. Date night får det att hända. Hitta det på amazon.se.
Upptäck Ford e-Custom, elversionen av Europas mest sålda transportbil. Den har upp till 370 kilometers räckvidd, snabbladdning och finns nu med 4-hjulsdrift. Just nu till Ford Pro Edition-pris från 479 000 ex-moms. Läs mer på Ford.se eller besök din Ford-återförsäljare. Ready, set, Ford.
Tänk om din plånbok kunde prata. Vad skulle den då säga om din relation till ekonomi?
Alla relationer har ju sina ups and downs. Men att han har lån lite här och där, det tror jag skulle vara en ick för rätt många plånböcker och inte bara för mig.
Ett första steg mot en bättre relation till sin plånbok kan vara att samla sina lån.
Samla dina lån till ett på lendo.se.
A kind of a hunchback and very badly disabled. And if this was a traditional Hollywood film, maybe starring Tom Hanks, exactly what the narrative would be, that he would join the 300 and he would maybe die saving them or something. He'd win redemption in that way. But in this one, he's physically loathsome, and so he's morally loathsome. And that's a very Greek way of understanding the world. And it's also very fascist, because fascism was a conscious attempt to repudiate the heritage of the Christian centuries and to get back to the world that had existed before, as the Nazis understood it, before Christianity. And so that meant, as they saw it, repudiating the worship of weakness and slavery that they felt that Christianity enshrined, and celebrating the strength and power and brutality. And also they were very, very keen, even as they look back to the pre-Christian world, they look forward to a future in which, again, Christianity would have been removed, and all would be a celebration of, in the Darwinian sense of power and glamour, both in the dimension of biology, but also in the field of technology. So when you mentioned Tolkien, when I came to write about the Nazis in Dominion, I mean, it's an enormous subject, and I was nervous about how I would tackle it and how I would frame it, and perhaps particularly the Holocaust and the role played in that by the churches. And actually, Tolkien seemed to me a brilliant way into it, because I realized that, Tolkien said that Lord of the Rings was not an allegory, and so people have always been slightly nervous about placing it in its historical context. But he was writing that in the build-up to the Second World War, through the Second World War, and then in the years that followed it, rather in the way that Mann was writing Dr. Faustus, and Camus and Sartre writing their books. Orwell was writing 1984. I think Lord of the Rings is one of the great fictional meditations on 20th century history, because, and it's a deeply Christian one, because it stares what was radical about Nazism in the face. It recognizes that it is a repudiation of the specifically Christian virtues, and it does so within the fabric of the novel. The Nazgul, the ring wraiths, men who are seduced by the prospect of power and become shadowy servants of the Dark Lord. I think it's hard not to see a kind of reflection, at least on the role played by the Christian churches in Germany. Obviously, there were many German Christians who suffered martyrdom, who refused to truckle to Nazism, but equally there were many in the German churches who did, and perhaps particularly in the Lutheran churches.
The reason I bring this up as well in this context, when you speak of the revolution, the Christian revolution, is of course that it's often through the history, at least, it's a revolution from below, and what you find, what you write about in Dominion, but also you've done an episode of on the rest is history about crucifixion, and if I remember this correctly, in the Roman world, it was seen as the most horrific and humiliating death.
Yes,
and for them, of course, it symbolized power. And it symbolized power for the Christians as well, but in an opposite way. And in that power lies also the revolution, or have I misinterpreted this?
Well, so to stick to Tolkien and what he's doing with it, he is writing. I can't remember exactly when he's writing the early chapters of Return of the King, but perhaps is it during the bombing, the late stages of the war? I can't remember. But anyway, it's kind of influenced by that. And obviously, the aim on the part of the Allies is the destruction of Nazism, and that is an absolute moral good, it seems. And so, therefore, the feeling is that anything is justified. So, hence the firebombing of Hamburg and of Dresden, and so on. And Tolkien's son Christopher is in the RAF, so he's in the military, the wing of the British Armed Forces that are doing this. And Tolkien writes to him and says, this is a terrible thing, because essentially what we're doing is, we're using the ring. And so we may overthrow Sauron, but if we use the ring, we will merely replace him with another Sauron, which is quite a radical position for a member, for someone in Britain in the war to hold, I think. He's quite a small minority of chiefly Christian leaders who are holding to that position. And at the heart of Lord of the Rings is exactly what you as a boy was kind of resentful of, all this kind of, Frodo and Sam slogging their way through Mordor and so on, rather than getting out their swords and charging down hills.
Exactly.
But actually, the whole point of Lord of the Rings is the refusal to use the ring. It's the abnegation of power. You have the power, but you refuse to use it. And, as you'll know, the destruction of Sauron happens on the 25th of March, which is the date supposedly of the holiest date in the Christian calendar, according to the early Middle Ages, when the period that Tolkien most loved, because that's the date when of the incarnation and of the crucifixion, or is it the resurrection? I can't remember. I think it's the resurrection, but it's the resurrection. It's the best day of the year, basically. But it happens because Christ. It becomes the model of self-abnegation. He's God, but he becomes mortal and he surrenders to death. And essentially that is the whole point at the heart of Lord of the Rings. And this is being written against the backdrop of fascism, the defeat of fascism. And how do you defeat fascism? How do you defeat an ideology that privileges power and strength? How can you defeat it in a way that doesn't privilege power and strength in itself?
I mean, this is we've for a long time. I mean, Nietzsche famously, it's almost boring to say it now, but when he said that God is dead, he didn't say it triumphantly. He described this as the dead God still continue to influence us and our way of thinking, and he was early in calling it, so to speak. I think maybe he said it prematurely a little bit, or maybe he didn't. But at least I think it's very true today. And how can you? I mean, if Christianity was used as a way to defend the weak and the poor, and of course it's not only been used like that, but it's been like a call to see in these my littlest of brothers, and to recognize the common humanity. And now, if we left Christianity, or at least we've left belief in Christ behind to a large degree in Western countries, and even in the United States more and more, have we also left the defenses against these other traditions where you don't when you don't have that same morality, when you have perhaps a more, maybe we've paved the way for a more fascistic or Darwinistic way of viewing each other? It's a very small question, isn't it?
Well, you described the famous parable that Nietzsche tells of the death of God and the madman in the marketplace who proclaims it. And in that parable, Nietzsche says that the corpse of God lies in the cave, but will continue to cast shadows long after his death, because the corpse is of such an enormous size, kind of distorting Plato, I guess. And I think that our memory of the Nazis is exactly that. It's a flickering of the corpse of God on the cave, because the question to ask about the Nazis is, why are they the epitome of evil? You know, why are they the epitome rather than Stalin or Mao or whoever? And I think the answer is that they, unlike the communists who aim to overthrow institutional Christianity, but who embodied a number of very hardcore Christian ideas, that the last should be first, that a millennial age will dawn where, you know, all is the New Jerusalem has basically has come to earth. You know, these are very, very kind of important communist ideas, and clearly brand them as Christian. The Nazis tried to trample down not just doctrinal Christianity, but the Nazis tried to trample down not just institutional Christianity, but its key doctrines, two of which are obviously the idea that the weak, the poor, the suffering have a value by virtue of their weakness and their poverty, and also that they disdain the idea that all human beings are equally created in the image of God and share an inherent dignity by virtue of that fact. They discarded both of those, and that, I think, is why we look on them with such horror. And the reason we look on them with such horror is because we retain our Christian instincts. And so I think that the Nazis in many ways have come to replace scripture as the kind of the lodestar of our collective morality. We don't, in a way, you know, the whole mythology of fascism and the defeat of fascism has become a mythology in the way that Christian notions of heaven and hell offered a mythology. So Hitler is the devil, Auschwitz is hell. These are mythologies that haunt us all. The question, of course, is the question that Nietzsche left hanging, which is what happens when the memory of that fades? Can we have Christian values without Christian belief? And I suspect probably not. I mean, or at least we will have, you know, Christian values will remain a very, very long time because they're hardwired into the fabric of our society. But without the framework provided by scripture or doctrine, they will start to mutate and go off in all kinds of strange, unexpected directions.
I think you're absolutely right about Nazism and Hitler, and we might not believe in God, but we believe in Hitler, and we know that we might not believe that Jesus was the son of God, but we for certainly know that Hitler was not. He was the son of someone else, and we also know that hell exists because Auschwitz existed, and that's as close an approximation of hell as you could get, perhaps. But what does it do then to a culture when we've lost faith in perhaps in the good or in light? We know then that hell exists and is possible, and we know that absolute evil exists. But it's like you leave the Christian inheritance is in half when you leave the other parts.
Well, I think compounding the challenge for us in the West is the fact that our global power is massively shrinking. And that's particularly the case, of course, for Europe. But I think for the West generally, the great privilege that we in the West have had for 250 years is that our cultural supremacy has been so great that we've been able to assume that things that are actually very culturally contingent are somehow to be equated with universal human nature, because that's the privilege of great powers. And so, you saw that in the World Cup at Qatar. The assumption was that, say, gay rights or women's rights or whatever, as they have as the understanding of them has emerged since the 60s, are somehow universal, and that is not, that's not what people in the West thought in the 60s, let alone what, by and large, over the past 1600 years, let alone what over the past 1400 years people in the Islamic world have thought. And I think that as Western power retreats, we're going to have to accept that actually things like human rights or sexual equality or gay rights or whatever are not simply universal values that we can argue for by saying, well, if you don't believe in them, then you're bigots. I mean, we may think that, but that's not going to persuade people who can turn around and say, yeah, but that's your cultural position. They're not universal; they're culturally conditioned. And I think that even on something that seems to most people in the West as basic as the secular. I mean, I kind of touched on that when we were talking about the 11th century. This idea that the world can be divided into twin dimensions that in the 11th century are couched in overtly theological terms. Today, we have notions that there is a space called the secular and that there are things called religions that should properly sit on the margins of the secular. And we assume that that's just the way things are, that it's a kind of rule of society. But it isn't. It's disguised theological proposition. It's a very, very Christian way of seeing the world. And again, you can see that these were assumptions that people from the West in the colonial period just exported and took for granted. So in India, the British imposed their idea that there are things called religions and that there's a space called the secular. They
went around looking for holy books and
looking for religions. So it's the British who invent the idea that there's a religion called Hinduism. There's no such thing in any Indian language before the British get there. And when the British leave, India is proclaimed a secular republic. And the party Congress, the party that rules India for decades after independence, very proud to define itself as secular. But you see with Modi, the current prime minister, and he articulates a notion called Hindutva, the idea that Hinduness, the idea that there isn't something called Hinduism that is a religion that is separate from the secular, but that everything in India is somehow a part of this ancient inheritance of the divine, of the supernatural, that Hindus have had for centuries and centuries and centuries. And that's what he wants to see restored. Likewise in Turkey with Erdogan, the same process is happening with Islam, that when Ataturk proclaimed Turkey a secular republic, he wasn't adopting a neutral position. He was consciously Westernizing. I mean, on that case, he was following the example of secular France, of the laïcité in France. So these are not neutral positions. And the more that the West goes into economic decline, so the more its culture will become something that comes to seem to the rest of the world as not being universal at all, as being very, very specific to our history. And I think that is a kind of, that's going to be a difficult process for people in the West to adjust to. And actually, particularly people on the left, people who would identify themselves as anti-colonialist, but who are the ones who are likeliest to protest at infringements of what they call human rights. But human rights are theologically based propositions that emerge from the specific context of Christian history and are not remotely universal.
I think it was Alistair McIntyre who, in his book After Virtue, he said that at an abduction dissection, nobody has ever found a human right.
Of course not.
And of course, I remember having these discussions like 20 years ago, and I thought I was coming up with something new as a 20-year-old, feeling you think you're so smart.
But
Then you realize it's first you realize they don't exist. I think that was my argument. But of course they do, because it's an agreement that they do exist. So they have a social existence. But at the same time, it can be to question certain things in our societies today is equivalent of questioning sacred tenets of an earlier period, so to speak.
Right.
If you, I mean, I remember reading political science as a student. That's when I had this genius idea that human rights didn't exist, and then almost every course I read had a democracy in it in one way or another, and I thought, like, what's happening here? We're not really studying democracy and how they work or not work. We're just like repeating. We're convincing ourselves about something here, and still, if you have discussions about politics, there are. If you say that you're against democracy in the West, at least, if that would be something you actually said, then that's basically like proclaiming that you're a Satanist. If you go back in time,
so. In the Middle Ages, there were councils. There were kind of the Lateran councils held at the palace of the Pope in Rome, and these issued decrees on doctrine that were Catholicos, universal. I mean, that's what it means. Basically, the meeting that established the Charter of the United Nations was exactly the same thing. It was a formulation of doctrine that was established as being Catholic, as being universal, and of course, to question that is heretical in exactly the way that questioning decrees from the various Lateran councils was heretical in the Middle Ages.
And I think that perhaps I bring it up because sometimes when you discuss these things and historical theological, like one of my favorite theological disputes was it was and is about what substance Jesus is of. Is he of exactly the same? Is the Son of the exact same substance as the Father, or of a similar substance? And it's very hard when you fast forward 1600 or 1700 years to understand why people were killing each other over that. But then you have questions now about, for example, what substance does an immigrant have and a native have, for example, or what does we discuss, and these are basically, some part of it have the same character as a theological discussion, but of course we think it's a rational discussion because we don't want to diminish ourselves. We think we are rational, so we discuss this in a rational, logical way. And but I feel a strong familiarity sometimes when you read these old theological debates.
I think the classic example of that is the debate over trans rights. And there is I don't know whether it's the same in Swedish, but there's a slogan in English that trans women are women.
It's the same.
And, that is a theological proposition. There's no objective evidence for it, but it is a statement of doctrine that one has to subscribe to. And likewise, the idea that people might be born into the wrong bodies is a very animist idea. It's the idea that there is a spirit that is separate from the body. So it's kind of very Platonist, very Christian. But it's a recalibration of overtly theological ideas in a way that is kind of radically discordant to traditional Christian teaching. Because, of course, if there is one idea that has been pretty fundamental in Christian teaching, and it's one that is older than Christianity because it derives from Genesis, it's the idea that man and woman were created separately. So the concern for trans rights would be inexplicable, I think, without the Christian concern for those who are marginalized, for those who historically have suffered. The idea that trans people have always been a marginalized people is a very, very important part of arguments from trans rights campaigners for social justice for them. But again, that argument depends on Christian assumptions. At the same time, the argument that men and women, that there's a continuum rather than a binary, is radically unchristian. And so I think there you see a kind of classic example of the kind of mutation that perhaps Nietzsche was thinking about when he said that, the shadows of God, it wouldn't exactly be God, but it would be a shadow, and shadows flicker and distort and change. And I think that's a kind of perfect example of what's happening.
And I mean, just to like one of the charges against the Albigensians or the Cathars that we were speaking about was that they had a belief that there were two gods, and it's been a
or did they? Or did they?
Yeah. It's the victors wrote history there. The rest is history.
No. Because actually, the victors kind of projected that. Well, listen, I'm not going to talk about it. Listen to our podcast on it. It's fascinating. It's not at all what you might think.
No, I highly recommend it. But I just think that there's might not be the best example then, but there's a tendency within Christianity that you have like the flesh is evil and the spirit is good. So you have to punish the flesh, and there's a temptation there that comes up.
Yeah, the Gnostic temptation.
Yeah, and I think the trans. I wrote about that, like the trans movement, that they were latter day Gnostics, and I got a lot of pushback because people thought that I were calling them irrational, because religious has that connotation that they were irrational and that they were I was accusing them of being superstitious and stupid, was basically the argument. But I was just saying that they have a different view of the flesh, because if God created this world, he also created the body you have. And that's why if you look at like people doing selective abortions for fetuses with Down syndrome, it's mainly Christians who are against that.
Because the idea that every human life is equally valuable is not an opinion that historically has in any way been universal. I mean, going back to the beginning of 300, that's why babies get chucked down the ravine.
No, Leonidas would not be against selective abortion, I think.
No, of course not.
No.
No, of course not.
För att lyssna på hela avsnittet kan du bli betalande prenumerant, vilket du kan bli på ivararpi.substack.com eller ivararpi.com. Båda adresserna fungerar. Och för 5 euro i månaden eller 50 euro om året så får du både allt gratis material, men du får också ta del av diskussionstrådar som bara är för betalande prenumeranter. Du får tillgång till vissa podcastavsnitt som bara är för betalande prenumeranter och vissa texter som bara är för betalande prenumeranter. Och jag har ingen reklam, jag har tar inte emot några pengar från marknadsföring eller liknande, utan jag förlitar mig helt och hållet på er läsare och lyssnare. Så genom att bli betalande prenumerant så gör ni det möjligt för mig att fortsätta att vara en självständig röst.